Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for those of you who have made the trip over here to Mathematica's Washington, D.C. Conference Center, and I also want to welcome those of you joining us on the webinar. My name's Ann Person, and I am the director of the Center for Improving Research Evidence, or CIRE, here at Mathematica. And I'm really pleased that you could all join us for this important event today. We hope that the discussion will contribute to ongoing efforts to make research more accessible and really more usable to the people who need to use it to inform policy and program decision making. Our format today is a little bit different. Rather than formal presentations from our panelists here, we'll begin with a moderated discussion, and then we'll take questions from you all here in the room and also from our audience on the webinar. Please note that we are video recording the session today, and we may capture images of some of you here in the Washington, D.C. audience. The video will be posted on our website later this week. In the meantime, to help ensure the highest possible sound quality, both for the video and for our webinar audience, I'd ask those of you in the room to please silence all your electronic devices. To lead our conversation today, I'm really excited to turn things over to my colleague, Anu Rangarajan, who's a senior vice president here at Mathematica and the managing director of our expanding portfolio of international projects. So with that, Anu, please take this.
Thank you, Ann. So today we're going to be talking about how to make research more useful to decision makers from two different perspectives. First, we'll talk about some ways to expand the toolkit of approaches used by researchers to help provide credible answers to policy questions. And second, we'll talk about how we can do a better job of interpreting research findings so they're easier to understand and hopefully harder to misunderstand. These topics are no doubt familiar to many in our audience and also our panelists. We're continuing discussions that took place at OPRE, at the OPRE methods meetings in 2016 and 2017. And also the CIRE forum from last March, which focused on the statement by the American Statistical Association on the widespread misinterpretation of p-values, and other similar discussions that have been taking place throughout. So our goal is to contribute to these important discussions by starting a public dialogue between people who are working for agencies that set policies, as well and those who develop and use research methods that generate evidence on which the agencies rely. So it is really my pleasure to introduce, and we're thrilled to have such a great lineup of panelists joining us today for this important conversation. I'd like to welcome Naomi Goldstein, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Planning, Research, and Evaluation in the Administration for Children and Families in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Tim Day, who's a health services researcher at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services Innovation Center. Liz Stewart, who's an associate dean for education at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. John Dakey, who's a senior researcher here at Mathematica. And Chris Jones, who's a senior consultant with BCT Partners, a Newark-based firm committed to providing insights about diverse people that lead to equity. So thank you all for being here. So the idea for this discussion was born out of conversations with both Tim and Naomi about some of the challenges that you faced in using evaluations to help shape policy. So for instance, in sometimes demonstration projects or interventions tested by your agencies don't always turn out to show strong positive results. But it's also that things didn't work, nothing worked. How do you navigate these situations? What do you take away from these studies?
Okay, good question, because in fact we often get results that are null or confusing or mixed. But a low success rate for innovation and experimentation is not unusual, and it's not specific to human services or government efforts at all. It's also the case in business or medicine or pharmaceuticals. So part of our task is to set expectations. I think it really helps if we don't frame the questions as a thumbs up or thumbs down, yes or no question, but rather as part of an improvement effort. And accordingly, we can design studies so that the results are useful even beyond whatever the impact findings show. So we might design ABC tests where we're looking at 3 different approaches. If they turn out to, if the results are null, but we've learned that the less expensive approach is just as effective as the more expensive approach, that's a worthwhile finding. In addition, we can test components or small tweaks to services. And lastly, if we're sure to include a robust implementation study, then we've got valuable information regardless of how the impacts turn out. And since we certainly can't control how the impacts turn out, it's important to design studies in that way.
Great, that's really helpful. How about you, Tim?
Yeah, so in our world, it turns out healthcare is hard. I think human services is also hard. So we rarely see, the slam dunk, this definitely worked kind of results. And the key for us to build on what Naomi said is really intuitively describing the uncertainty around estimates to our policymakers, right? So they can look at a point estimate, but the question they consistently come back to is, well, how likely is it that this intervention saved money or improved quality of care? So it's a very particular framing, and they want sort of intuitive, relatable answers. And oftentimes what they then do, they want to bring their own risk tolerance. So they'll look at an intervention that maybe they've had a lot of experience with, have seen in the literature a lot. Maybe they're willing to take more of a bet on that and take a less certain estimate and count on it. Whereas something that's really novel, perhaps with the same results, they'd say, well, let's get more data, let's test it in another scenario before they really want to commit to that idea. So.
Thank you. Chris, your background is pretty unique in the sense of you have experience both as a researcher, but then you've also spent time running a community development initiative in Boston. So can you talk a little bit about your experience in applying research to what you were doing with the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, and perhaps briefly mention what that initiative is for those who may not know?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, and it's great to be here. I appreciate the comments you all just made a second ago. The Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is a community-based organization that's in the city of Boston that's really around resident empowerment. It started out around resident empowerment for housing and then moved to education, health, workforce development, and the like. But at the core and the essence is resident empowerment. And I think if I look at kind of the intersection of the worlds that I've existed in, both the research perspective and the community development perspective, the thing that I keep coming back to, and I hope this answers your question, is the fundamental question that I think we should all be asking, and that's why. So as researchers, I think we fundamentally have to ask why. Like, why are we doing research? Why do the answers matter to policymakers? Why do our tools need to be better? Why is it that they need to be appropriately interpreted? Once we can get at the why, then I think that'll better drive our decisions throughout the process, and it'll help us frame who we bring into to the fore. I think the why is that we want to foster better citizens, which then lead to a better society. So that would be my why. But ultimately, I think we have to ask the why question, and that's what I really learned at the intersection of the two.
That's great. And that resonates a little bit with what you were saying to Naomi about implementation research and things which ask a lot of it complements the quantitative research and learning a lot about the hows and the whys. So exactly. That's great. To conduct let me turn a little bit to expanding the toolkit, the first topic of our conversation today. To conduct a rigorous research evaluation, we typically need a counterfactual, which helps us understand what outcomes would have been for those in the intervention group in the absence of the intervention, what they would likely have faced. And the gold standard for developing the counterfactual has been randomized control trials, or RCTs. But RCTs are not always feasible, or perhaps not always the best approach for every situation. And both of your agencies have been leaders in promoting RCTs with a strong focus on generating the most rigorous evidence base. But there are some contexts where RCTs may not work. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience has been and what context you find that RCTs aren't feasible or may not be the best choice? How common are those contexts, and what types of approaches do you use in those?
Yeah, so we're very fortunate at the Innovation Center. For those of you who aren't familiar, we're given the authority to test new ways to pay for and deliver care for our Medicare and Medicaid populations. And so we actually have a lot of control over how we set up our interventions. And as a researcher, I always want to go with the RCT, right? That's the gold standard. That's what we want to do. And I think the biggest barrier from my perspective has been misconceptions about what it means to be randomized, to be experimental. And especially in healthcare, they think of like a drug trial, which is very rigid, has these hard rules that seem inflexible. So from my vantage point as a researcher, I feel like it's incumbent on me and the other researchers in this room to sort of educate the policymakers, the people designing the intervention, about alternatives to the traditional sort of drug trial model of randomization, to give them more options to do the very best evaluation they can. So with that said, though, there's certainly plenty of situations where we can't do an experimental design, have to fall back on the types of quasi-experimental designs that I think others on the panel will talk about.
And Chris, maybe, sorry, sorry, Naomi, from your agency's perspective, sorry.
Okay, so I actually have a lot to say about this question. So
Good.
before getting to the point about situations where one would like to do an RCT, but there are barriers, I just want to mention that there are other types of questions for which an RCT is not the ideal answer. So we might want to understand how a program is being implemented, what are the needs of the service population, who is our program reaching. So there are lots of times when an RCT is not the first choice. Of course, if you want to understand impacts, then an RCT probably is your first choice. And I want to echo something that Chris said, which is that we don't want to understanding effectiveness is not actually our end goal. I think it's easy, I often think that it is, but really we want to understand effectiveness so that we can improve. So if you can't do an RCT, maybe there's another question that might be better addressed. So better to do a good implementation study than an impact study that doesn't have credibility. So sometimes if we can't do a good impact study, we'll do a different kind of study. I do also want to say that I think RCTs are feasible more often than people sometimes think. Often when there are objections, they can be addressed by tweaking the design, and I think that's part of what Tim was saying. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Maybe this might be a good time to ask Chris, kind of from your lens of being the community organization's perspective, how does an organization view implementing, say for example, there is interest in learning about impact of a program, and there is interest in running an RCT.
Right.
What's been your experience? You've sort of, as a researcher, you've probably implemented RCTs, but also from the lens of a community organization. How would you view that? And is it, are you normally eager to learn and anxious about what the results of the RCT are going to show, or do you kind of think that, well,
it depends on what hat I'm wearing. If I put my researcher hat on, I'm very eager to learn, and to your point, I want to know what the results are and what the data shows. If I put my community development hat on, my sort of community-based hat on, then there's some important considerations. Tim, you mentioned issues that communities have with trials. In particular communities, not the least of which is the African American community, there's a long history of research being done on communities not for the benefit of those communities. So the why was not to benefit the communities. So I think what I'd lead with an appreciation of those who are affected the most, and then that gets to, well, are we asking the appropriate question given what we can do and given the context? And a quick example, we had an initiative through Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative to do family economic development, family economic success. And the funder wanted us to pick a set of families in the neighborhood and then not pick another set of families. So he wanted to randomly do it. He wanted to randomize controlled testing. And per trial. And so we had issues with that, and the community had issues with that because of the relationships we had with all of the individuals. And we had evidence that this would work. So instead, what we did was we chose a sort of an opt-in phased approach, which allowed the individuals who were interested to opt in, and we did it in phases across the geography, and that kind of was a different way to get at our randomized control. But we only were able to get there because we brought those people to the table and had conversations about what might work and what might not work.
Yeah. So I think that's right, and in my experience too, and as you pointed out, Naomi, we often think that RCTs are going to be really hard to implement, but I think if you work closely with the implementers and try to figure out how to make sure that things aren't completely getting disrupted from their perspective, you can usually come up with a way to do it. Maybe I'll turn to Liz and John, and in the vein of, I think Chris started talking a little bit about phased-in approaches. Can you talk a little bit about sort of promising or other novel types of RCT designs or other promising non-experimental designs that could help when the question of interest is learning about impacts?
Yeah, I'll start with this, and it builds really nicely on what we've been hearing. And Chris, I love that example you just gave because I think it's such a nice example of thinking creatively. I think for impact evaluation, sort of creative thinking is almost as important as sort of following a recipe. And people don't always, there's sort of art to it as well as science. And so sort of to answer your question, I think there's a whole number of designs. I teach a causal inference class, which some people in this room have taken. And my goal in that class is to really convey a spectrum of design. So not like I sort of try to separate design from analysis, and sort of a spectrum of designs in the spirit of expanding the toolkit. So I love that framing. Sort of teach people about randomized encouragement designs, which is, you can sort of think of as similar to what you did, where you can randomize encouragement to participate rather than directly randomizing sort of participation. Instrumental variables and being clever about identifying instruments that exist out in the world. Randomized encouragement is one example of that. Interrupted time series and comparative interrupted time series, and there's lots of advances recently in sort of methods for that. Comparison group designs, where you are smart about picking comparison groups to be similar to the intervention group. So again, there's a whole spectrum that range from a very classical kind of medical RCT to a, very basic, two-group, two-time point or something difference in difference design. And again, my goal in the course is to kind of give people these designs so that then when they're out in the real world talking with community members or whoever, funders, whoever it is, they can sort of have these in the back of their head to say, oh, right, oh yeah, this seems to fit. Regression discontinuity, for example. And just expanding knowledge of the spectrum, I think then helps make sure that in any given study, people can be choosing the thing that makes sense and not just choosing the one thing that they learned.
That's good. That's great.
Yeah, I would echo Liz's comments. I think that when we learn different designs, different methods for assessing causal relationships in school, we're existing in this space of math, and you have all of these assumptions, and sometimes people create like these hierarchies, like this method is the best, and then you have these other methods. But the challenge, and I particularly see this with sometimes with newer researchers at Mathematica, is to map from the land of math into the real world. And the way that you map a path from the math into the real world is you go out and you talk to people, just like what Chris was describing. And you can't do it without talking to people. So if you want to think about, are the assumptions of a regression discontinuity design credible in a particular case? Are the assumptions of a comparative interrupted time series design credible in a particular case? Which is the better design? There is no universally better design. You need to go out and talk to people. You need to understand the mechanisms and the context by which people end up participating in a program. And and then you can figure out what's the best design for that context. And it could differ across different contexts.
So I just wanted to reinforce the point that's been made here about whether you're doing an experimental study or a non-experimental study, some of the basic principles are the same, where you want to have a credible counterfactual. You want to be able to rule out alternative explanations. But regardless of design, you have to apply those general principles to your specific situation. So, what are the threats to validity in your context, and are they likely to be large or small? And then you can develop a design that fits the question and the context.
Good point. So Liz, you mentioned comparison group designs, and propensity score modeling is an approach that's often used to create a counterfactual or comparison group when an RCT isn't feasible. Could you perhaps just talk us briefly through what propensity score matching is at a very high level, but then talk a little bit about some of the new developments? I mean, this is a method that's been used quite a bit, and many times there's a sense that it doesn't work very well, but maybe some of the newer methods and tools may help in that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the basic idea, for those of you who don't know, of propensity scores is they are a strategy for selecting comparison subjects that look as similar as possible to the group, the receiving the program or policy of interest. So instead of trying to, if you have someone getting the program, instead of trying to find someone else who's exactly the same as them on their age and their educational history and 20 different things, you can sort of summarize that using this propensity score. And then because of the properties of the propensity score, in the end, you get groups, like a group of program participants and a group of non-participants who look similar to each other sort of on average with respect to those observed characteristics. And so before I get to new advances, I want to just pause and say two things that I see people sort of misusing propensity scores. And the first is what we were saying earlier, in that I think sometimes people have a hammer and they just use, it's like the only thing they know. So they're like, oh, I'll do propensity scores. And sort of second then is not thinking carefully about what are the important confounders. So in epi sort of speak, confounder, sort of something related to exposure and outcome. And people don't pay enough attention to thinking through exactly what Naomi's saying. In our case, what are the likely variables that relate to program participation and outcomes, and do we observe those? And if there's a whole bunch of those that you don't observe, that's probably not a good setting to be using propensity scores. There are sensitivity analyses that I think are underused to assess sensitivity to an unobserved factor. And I think that's an area that could have lots more work. But in my experience, like that's sort of one of the challenges is people not thinking through, well, what is the assumption? And then does it actually fit here? In terms of recent advances, there's a whole literature. There's sort of on the technical side, there's lots of advances on like the sort of algorithms for picking matches. Some use propensity scores, some don't, but have the same goal in the end. There's some interesting work on sort of dealing with complications, because the math is sort of for nice, clean scenarios, but what if you have complex survey data? What if you have multi-level settings? What if you have missing covariates? Things like that. So there's a whole literature there. But I think fundamentally for our purposes, the things that I see as the most important to be being used in sort of newer advances are these sensitivity analyses and a growing literature on sort of understanding what are the important variables to be able to control for. And building up that literature is going to be really important.
Right. Now, suppose you have an RCT, you have a study that has multiple designs that are embedded in it, and you find you have an RCT design that says a thing and a good matching study that shows something different, both about the same intervention. How do you kind of know which one to believe in? Or they both be right, neither right? Has that ever happened in your experience? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Do you want me to do that one, or do you want to?
You can go first.
Alrighty. I think that's often a very challenging context, particularly when you have different studies that are trying to look at the same thing. So you might have one study that's an RCT evaluating a program, and maybe it's conducted in California. And then you have a quasi-experimental design conducted in New York. And they give very different answers. And so you're looking at these two things, and you're like, well, did it work? Did it not work? What do I believe? I mean, the RCT is more rigorous, but the quasi-experimental design was in a different context. You just might have different impacts in those two different contexts. It's very challenging to reconcile these different messages coming from different parts of different designs. And I think that this has been a challenge for evidence reviews. Evidence reviews have handled this by sort of putting findings from studies of different designs into sort of different buckets and trying to be clear about these have a little bit more credibility or maybe a lot more credibility than these. But it's still a challenging issue to resolve that. And one of the things that I think is kind of exciting potentially moving forward is that we've had people doing a lot of what they call within study comparisons, where you have opportunities to both assess the impact of something using an RCT and a non-experimental design in the same study. And you can use that RCT as sort of like a benchmark, as like the gold standard, and you can look at the difference between the two. Now, the difference between the two could be due to randomness, so you don't know for sure. But as this literature builds, it's going to, I think, provide us with an estimate of the distribution of bias from non-experimental studies. And as we develop that distribution of bias estimates, I am cautiously optimistic that we will be able to productively use that information to better gauge our assessment of the credibility of quasi-experimental findings, so that we can make more comparable statements between these two things. And just, I know I'm not supposed to dive into technical details, but in the case of regression discontinuity design, there is an example. It's a very, very, very specific example. But what they do is they inflate the standard error for the impact estimate to protect against a certain type of bias. And they've shown that that works. And so that's a very particular case. But I think that the spirit of that could potentially be applied more generally, so that we can be more quantifiably specific about the credibility of the quasi-experimental designs, rather than just being like, I don't know. So that's my hope. I think there's reasons to believe that might work out.
Great.
Can I add? Yeah, I will just echo that and also turn it into sort of statistics speak for a second, which is that one of the challenges in these within study comparisons, I agree, especially with sort of particular designs where they're sort of really done very carefully, are useful. But in general, a challenge when you just have an RCT and another study is, in statistical speak, that the estimands are often different. So the estimand is the thing you're trying to estimate. And you know, it's right. The settings are different. The populations are different. The treatment itself might be different. The comparison condition might be different. And so then you might have different estimates, but each of them might be perfectly valid for the thing it is trying to estimate. And so it adds this challenge of kind of trying to go this way when in reality, each of them is actually trying to estimate something different.
That's helpful.
So maybe I shouldn't be too optimistic.
No, I think that in some of the within study comparisons, they're done in a more careful way. So for example, common measurement and an observational arm next to an RCT arm. And I actually would love to see more of those sorts of things, and taking advantage of that. Or the people who aren't willing to be randomized, maybe we can still follow them and collect non-experimental data on them. And still challenges in interpretation, but I think there's steps that we could take along the way.
Great. You were talking a little while ago about propensity score methods and what new methods or new approaches there are to try to improve upon them. I'm wondering, Tim, have you encountered any situations where, for example, propensity score modeling didn't produce credible comparison groups or impact estimates? And what do you do in those situations? What lessons do you take away from it?
Yeah, and I think to echo some of this conversation back, it's always hard to know, did it go right, did it go wrong? But there's certainly situations where you see either from implementation research or just theory that you get implausibly large or implausibly early estimates, that sort of thing. And I think some of this is a symptom of this sort of recipe approach where, especially in Medicare research, we have all this administrative data. It's so tempting just to throw everything into propensity score model, and then you can say, in your journal manuscript, we did propensity score matching. Generally, that's not going to get too many questions. People sort of take it for granted. When you miss all the thoughtfulness of, well, did you get the right variables? Are there unmeasured variables? Which variables are best matched? Which ones aren't? So I'll say that, that's sort of a first threshold step to make sure that what you're getting out of your propensity score group is even somewhat credible. Just saying that it's propensity score matched doesn't really tell me much of anything. So getting back to, even when you're incredibly careful, incredibly thoughtful, we see results sometimes that just do not make sense, right? And I think those are situations where we need to be prepared to say it looks like something went wrong. It could be the comparison group. It could be some other measurement error, and really be careful about revising to get to where we want. And I should add, I think an important part of that is pre-specification. So we want to guard against situations where we see unfavorable results that we just don't like, that might be plausible, and revising our design based on that. Instead, we want to pre-specify, here's sort of the time trend of the results, here's the range of impact estimates we expect, and then allow ourselves in situations where it's not plausibly within those ranges to say, well, we decided in advance that these were the ranges outside of which we would revisit our design, and that's what we're going to do. And so I think it's important to balance the transparency and rigorousness with some ability to say at some point this quasi-experimental design is not plausible.
Right.
Can I add to that? Yeah. I will say the two pet peeves I have when I see propensity score things is one, we used propensity scores, period. Right. That's not helpful. And then second is when they don't sort of show the proof that they worked, and you alluded to this, that propensity scores theoretically in large samples and by statistical properties should give you this good covariate balance. They should create groups that look similar. But I want to see that, and sometimes I see people use propensity scores and then just say, we used them, sort of trust us. I want to see the table that shows that it actually did lead to groups that are more similar, and if it doesn't, that's a sign that you maybe need to go back and think, is there a subset that things look better for? What's going on?
And to take that one step further, when you see that balance table, you see the variables they used, right? So if it's a bunch of things that it's clear they just threw the kitchen sink at, then you should be a little bit more skeptical.
Or if it's just three things.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the phrase "a rich set of covariates" is it's like
doubly robust.
It's like Ricardo Montalban in the fine Corinthian leather. It just sounds so regal and impressive, but when you see the table and it's like, well, it's gender and it's race,
You're highlighting to the fact that when you're using, even with RCTs, you need to lay all these things out, but when it's not an RCT, it's even more critical to make sure that the reader knows exactly what you've done. That's really, I'm kind of curious. So they talked about a range of methods. Not all of them are new. They've been used for a while. Regression discontinuity, propensity score matching, which you talked about, other comparison designs. So again, from an impact question perspective, how has your agency viewed some of these other methods? Do you still try for the gold standard RCT, or is there, at the outset you said it really depends on the context and you're obviously not wedded to it, but still at the end of the day, is it still an RCT? You want to try for an RCT, and if it doesn't work, let's try. Can you talk a little bit about your...
Sure. So for impact questions, we're still pretty keen on RCTs. However, we often will build on an RCT to try out other methods. So I want to give two examples. Well, one is that case, and the other is more like the local community situation that Chris mentioned. So in our impact study of the Health Profession Opportunity Grant Program, hi Steve, we have used it's an impact study with 23 different sites. So we've used the variation across the sites to try to understand how characteristics of the sites and their program implementation affect impacts. And I would say one of the takeaways from that is echoes some of the things that were said here about the importance of making sure you think about what type of information you want to be able to plug in. You've got to collect information about not just participants, but site characteristics as well if you want to be doing analyses at that level. So you want to have information beyond, did a site, yes or no, implement a certain thing, and have some information about intensity or duration or quality of implementation. And the second example I would give, one context where we have been exploring different methods as the primary approach, is in the local tribally led evaluations of the maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting program. So we have worked very closely with tribal communities to design evaluations that are acceptable in their context, because like African Americans, tribal communities have an unfortunate history of evaluation and researches that was in many cases not built around the needs of the local community, and sometimes were outright unethical and harmful. So we have been working with a number of tribal communities to develop designs that suit. And those are situations where there may be a small community where everybody knows everybody. You can imagine that random assignment would be difficult to implement in such a setting. So we've worked on developing some single case designs, match comparison groups, and regression continuity designs in those contexts.
That's great. Tim?
Yeah, I think a lot of that resonates. I guess I'd add, we've been talking a lot, I think, about determining the average impact, when I think oftentimes the most impactful question is what worked for whom, not whether it works on average. So if you could identify a subgroup for whom it really drove impacts, that could change policy, right? And it would be, I think we need to be guard against just looking at these average effects where we might miss really promising results by not looking at subgroups, not taking the time to work through the implementation side as well to point us to those hypotheses to test. So that's the other major area that I would focus on.
And Chris, anything to add in that from your community lens, community hat perspective?
No, I think they covered it.
Yeah,
So
great,
yeah, I think
great.
we're good.
Great, wonderful. Maybe it's a good time to sort of segue to the second topic of today, which is really improving how we interpret research findings. Even though we have ways to get credible estimates of program effects, we often hear that there continue to be a gap between what policymakers really need and what researchers are used to providing. And one of the ways to address this is to work together to do a better job of interpreting research findings. So this topic was thrust into the limelight in 2016 with the ASA statement on the misinterpretation of p-values. Now, while that is an incredibly important issue and a major challenge for the field, the challenges of correctly interpreting research findings are much larger than just the p-value issue, and we hope to touch on some of that today. Again, let me start with sort of the policy perspective. So the existing tools of the trade, such as p-values and confidence intervals, sometimes can be difficult to interpret and make sense of, particularly if there is not a strong research background. I'm wondering if you have any comments on what type of challenges using these types of statistics pose to how your agencies are able to sort of interpret research findings.
So I'm going to jump in because my answer is pretty quick, and then I think Tim might have a more nuanced approach. So what I would say is that p-values and confidence intervals are sometimes understood by decision makers, often not so much. But frankly, even if you understand them, they're not all that useful for interpreting findings, which is one reason that for the ASA statement. And Tim has really been a leader in thinking about how to present uncertainty to decision makers. So I'm going to hand it off to him to say more.
Yeah, and I've thought a lot about it, and I'd rephrase the question. I'd say interpreting p-values and confidence intervals are always hard, right? When they start seeming easy, that's usually when you're slipping into misconceptions, right? And many researchers, myself included, slip into misconceptions.
Yep.
So it's not surprising that our stakeholders or policymakers don't understand them regularly either. We did a set of semi-structured interviews with a dozen of our executive level policymakers, and only one of them could properly sort of define a p-value in its entirety. And the issue is they're just not thinking in terms of null hypotheses, right? It's not the way we think as humans. So unless you just come out of Liz's course, and it's been drilled into you, or you just don't naturally think that way. And so yeah.
Even if you knew it at some point in time, when you go to practical applications, it's maybe I'll turn to Liz and John. So it's sort of the misuse of p-values has been a pretty important topic in the research community and was discussed at the previous SIA forum, which actually Tim was here at that time too. This was last March. Do you think p-values are still relevant, and how should they be used?
You want me to do that one first?
Yeah.
All righty. So, I think I really like the point that Naomi just made about it's not so much, it's not a question of whether they're hard to understand or not, it's are they useful? And I think part of the reason people misinterpret them is not so much that it's hard to follow the definition, it's that you want them to be something else. What you really want to know is a different thing. And when you hear the definition of a p-value stated in words, it sounds very much like what you want. And you only start to notice that it's not what you want when it's stated in equations and math, but most people can't read that, and even the people who claim to be adept at it are really just trying to impress their friends. So it's
Does that work?
Yeah, it depends on your friends. But so I think that's part of the problem, is that it's just not answering the question that people want. Now, a caveat is that p-values are used in a wide variety of contexts and fields, and it's hard to make a declarative statement that something has no value in any context whatsoever. I'm sure that there are maybe situations where it is useful. I think it's fair to say that all else being equal, which is a very strong statement, a smaller p-value is better than a larger p-value. I think that's fair to say. And I think that there might be some value to backwards compatibility with the installed base of research readers and researchers who are familiar with it. And so I could imagine that maybe they still need to be reported for some period of time. But I think if I were to look forward into the future and imagine some equilibrium state, I don't think we'll be using them very much in the field of evaluation.
So can you talk a little bit about other test statistics or probabilities that researchers should be looking to use instead?
Well, I think there are a lot of options. If one were to, for the sake of backwards compatibility again, continue to use the hypothesis testing framework, you can calculate something called a false discovery rate. And so if you think back to what some of the earlier questions were about how it's unusual for interventions to have effects. Like the proportion of interventions that have effects is perhaps not super, super high. And that's understandable. There's the old saying, which is probably not true, that like 90% of small businesses fail in the first year. I don't think that's actually true. But yeah, it's so that's fine, and that's understandable. But that is the type of information that you need to know in order to calculate something like the false discovery rate. So if you know the proportion of things that actually work, then given your statistically significant impact estimate, you can figure out the probability that this thing worked. And that also leads me then to Bayesian statistics, which also is taking external information regarding the probability that interventions work and incorporating that information into an estimate of the probability that the intervention works given what you've estimated. And that's called a Bayesian posterior probability. So, and that's not based on
Can you repeat that one more time for those who might not be familiar with Bayesian methods?
Sorry. So if you have information about how often programs work, and Bayesians would call that prior information. If you have information about how common it is for programs to work, then you can calculate the probability that the program you're studying worked given your impact estimate. So you look at your treatment and control group, you get a difference in the outcomes. You're like, okay, I got this difference in the outcomes, but what's the probability that this thing actually worked? Because I know that this could be due to random differences. And you can only answer that question, what's the probability that the intervention worked given my impact estimate, if you have information about how common it is for interventions to work. And that's prior information in the Bayesian framework. You can calculate that probability, and it's called a Bayesian posterior probability.
Liz, do you have any sort of thoughts on the value of p-values and other probability-based methods, approaches?
I sort of do. I'm actually, though, going to add a different wrinkle.
Okay.
I think John responded very nicely to the sort of p-value part. What I want to add is that I think, and linking this back to the earlier conversation, a nice thing about a nice, clean, randomized experiment is that there's no other assumptions that you need. And so the p-value is capturing sort of the uncertainty that's just due to sort of random chance, statistical uncertainty. A problem that we have in non-experimental studies is that there's always going to be some other assumption you have to make. No unobserved confounders, exclusion restriction, whatever it is, there's going to be some assumption that you have to make. And I think one thing that as statisticians, haven't done well is help provide tools for people to help understand sensitivity and sort of robustness to violations of those assumptions. So in my kind of grand vision of the world, I could imagine nice graphs that sort of help people understand, well, you know, we did an IV analysis, instrumental variables analysis. If the exclusion restriction was violated, here's sort of the range of like estimates that we might have. And I think there's been very little attention to that. And in some ways, I think that might help people feel more comfortable with the non-experimental designs if we had better tools for articulating and sort of illustrating the robustness to the kind of key assumptions.
So are these things you're introducing to your grad students now? And
sadly, no. I research ideas for others. I think there are baby steps. So Dylan Small at Penn is doing there's some stuff in this area. I think a lot of it, though, in particular, hasn't gotten translated to the policy world. It's just emerging in the statistical world.
So I just want to emphasize that sensitivity analysis is your friend. That when you have to make assumptions, people are going to challenge your findings, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes the answer is, oh yeah, we couldn't control for that, but actually you would have to have whopping big variation in that thing for it to affect our estimates at all. It's rarely that simple, but sometimes. So you got to find those opportunities.
No, that's a good point. You were mentioning Bayesian earlier, and given that Bayesian methods are only recently getting more known in our evaluation world and circles, and perhaps not quite as well understood by many policymakers, they could be viewed with some question marks or with some hesitation about using them. I don't know, do you sense that there are any pitfalls in using these methods and these types of approaches that policymakers or researchers should be aware of?
I think that's a really good question, Anu. I think that one thought that occurred to me when the p-value statement came out from the ASA is that the fault ultimately does not lie in our statistical stars, but in ourselves. We have a tendency to misinterpret things. We have a tendency to want things to be simple when they're complex. I think that researchers, I've heard Naomi make this point, so I want to give her credit as I steal it. I think researchers have a tendency to always say, well, that's an interesting question. Here's the one I can answer. You know, it's like we always have this gap between what people want to know and what we can give them in a way that we feel really confident about it. And that's going to be true with Bayesian posterior probabilities as well. So you need to pay attention to exactly what prior information, for example, is being used. You need to make sure that you understand that in many cases, unless it is specifically constructed to be otherwise, the Bayesian posterior probability is telling you the probability that the effect you observed in your study was real. It's not making a predictive statement about whether it's going to work in someone's context. And I think wanting to know if it works in your context, in your neighborhood, that's what people really want to know. But that's still very hard for us to do. And so I think we just need to, you know, it's better, it's an improvement, but people are always going to want more. And so I think we just need to be clear what it is and what it's not.
That's great.
Can I just mention too, I think it's important to acknowledge that all of the design issues that we talked about in the first part still apply.
Right.
Right? Like this is just the last 10 yards.
Right.
If you've like fumbled the ball up 90 yards, you know, you're not going to score a touchdown.
I don't think it works that way.
Something like that. I'm big into
We know what
sports.
you meant.
Run into your own end zone.
It's good I'm not making a football analogy. Moving away from hypothesis to the sort of the policy folks, you know, moving away from hypothesis testing, which we've used for years, seems like a big change. And do you have any thoughts on how your agency or folks at your agency might embrace that, how you view that, you know, what kind of concerns it might raise, what could researchers, I know Liz and John talked about, and Liz in particular talked about a lot of things to help make things more easy and accessible, and I think their points were really helpful, but do you have anything more to add to that?
Yeah, so I guess I'm not quite as optimistic or bullish as John that we won't see p-values. I think at least right now we sort of conceive as these new methods as complementing what we do rather than substituting for them. I think there will always be policymakers who are more comfortable with, you know, show me the table with the confidence intervals and the p-values. But, you know, I think we have seen a lot of interest in things like, you know, presenting probabilities from a posterior distribution. And I think from my experience doing that so far, it's been really important to sort of step through the stakeholders through the whole process. So you don't just end up with a posterior distribution that you show them. You start with, well, here the priors were specifying, what do you think? Do you think those are reasonable? Get their feedback if there are other assumptions that they would make. You can even come up with a range of assumptions that you might build in to test how sensitive the posterior is to different priors. But really getting that buy-in so it doesn't seem like a black box where you sort of put your thumb on the scale and have everyone that might be critical to using the results where possible understand sort of the assumptions going into it.
So this might be the first disagreement that the panel has had.
Okay.
I think in my context, well, a couple things. So I think this is very big. I think it's potentially a sea change. You know, in the small world where I reside, you know, trying to share research results, sponsor, you know, research, and then share those results with policymakers. I think this is a big change right at that crux. And I think it already is taking years and will continue to take years. So you know, we're still very much at a stage of, gee, maybe we should dip a toe into this Bayesian stuff. And that is taking years, in part because most of our staff are trained in probabilistic methods. So I think the education of up-and-coming researchers and up-and-coming policymakers who maybe had one statistics course and maybe only remember p-values, I think that's really important. And of course, that will take time to play out. So I am, the part where I would disagree is just that I think in my experience, our policy decision makers really just want the bottom line. What did you learn? And of course, we're always saying, oh, it's really complicated, and there's a little bit of this and a little of that, and if you make this assumption, this, and this for this population and that for that population, and they literally want two sentences much of the time. So I think it will be rare that we could get them to sit still for what you're describing. And then
Map their utility functions.
yeah. So I think that this shift, which I do see happening, and think it's a it's a good thing, but I think it calls for a lot of thought, and I'm not sure I even know what the exact questions are. But I've been really interested to learn from Tim's experience, to talk with other federal evaluation officers, to hear from our contractors and other stakeholders in this world, because I would hate for this shift to somehow undermine confidence, so to speak, in probabilistic methods. And then we introduce this new thing, which can be confusing in itself, and I don't want it to lead to undermine confidence and credibility of really the best work that we can do. So I think there are a lot of questions to think about and how to communicate about it.
Great. And Chris, your reaction to these alternatives, like any thoughts? Are you?
It's I was going to say this at the end, but I'll say it now. I think my reaction is that the conversation makes me think about faith and superheroes. Right. So, at some point, we take a leap of faith. To your point, Naomi, policymakers want to know the bottom line, because at the end of the day, you can't know everything. And researchers understand that, and researchers want to nuance that out and try to get as close to the edge as possible and explain all the details and all the assumptions. But and researchers are resistant to taking a leap of faith, absolutely resistant. Like, we don't want to do it. I'll tell you what I know, and I don't know anything else. But that makes me think of superheroes, and I think if an effective researcher, an effective evaluator who wants to influence policy such that we shape and change society, then the superhero they would probably be the fly. The fly can instantaneously drop down into the nanoscale, which I think is the details, Bayesian methods, p-values, and fully understand it, and instantaneously come back up to the macro, and is able to translate the sort of the genetic, or to able to maintain genetic integrity at the nanoscale and at the macro scale. And I think an effective evaluator is able to maintain some sense of integrity, whether you are in a deep, heated discussion with experienced researchers, or whether you're telling a policymaker the bottom line that they need to hear so they can go make a decision because they have a million decisions to make. So that's what it makes me think of.
Excellent. I think this is a perfect place to pause, and then now let's turn to thank the panelists for kind of sharing your thoughts on these methods and approaches. And now I'd like to turn to some of the in-person and webinar audience questions that I'm sure you guys are piling up. A reminder to those of you who are watching online to please submit your questions through the Q&A panel of the webinar. We look forward to answering as many questions of your questions as time will permit. And whether posing a question in person or online, please be sure to state your name and affiliation. And I'm going to alternate between in-person audience and webinar questions. Okay, Steve Bell.
Hi, Steve Bell from Westat. Wait for the microphone. Oh. What a super use of an hour. I'm so glad to have been here, and thank you all. I wonder about use of confidence intervals. You mentioned them, Tim. That's a frequentist thing that isn't going to be what people would like to see it be. a statement about truth, right? But is there a role for confidence intervals in assessment of impacts for policy? Liz?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just, since I straddle public health, public policy, et cetera, I would say that in public health world, and with my biostat hat on, there's a real push to always show confidence intervals. And so, yeah, they don't totally solve the problem because they still have the interpretation challenges. But Scott Zieger, who is faculty at Hopkins with me, any paper, he's sort of like, if you're going to show a p-value, you should also show a confidence interval, because it at least helps understand sort of, is the interval 0.02 to 10, or is it 3 to 5? And it just provides, even if people don't interpret it quite correctly, it just can be so useful. And I think much is more better than like point estimate and standard error, where people still have to like do a little mental calculation. So my short answer is like, I would say that yes, that confidence intervals can be a step towards helping with interpretation, and that certainly tables should include them along with other statistics.
But I'll say that they are easy, maybe easier than p-values to misinterpret at times. We had a particular policymaker ask us to make 80% confidence intervals for him, and we didn't really understand, what he was getting at. And this is maybe one of the issues with dealing with policymakers who have had like that one stats course, and so they know what they're talking about. And so we finally figured out, what he wanted to see was, give me the range where it's an 80% chance that the impact fell in this range. And that's not fundamentally what we were answering, and that's more of a Bayesian question. So in some ways, I think it is a good practice if you're going to go the traditional route, but it isn't necessarily a panacea.
I feel like it's a good measure of precision. It lets you know how precisely estimated your impact was, and it's easier to interpret, as Liz was saying, than just reporting a standard error. But in terms of knowing what you ultimately want to know, which was what's the probability this worked, it's only half of the puzzle.
Great. Let's go to a webinar question.
Okay. Our first question is from, let's see, so many questions. Our first question is from Joshua Booker, and this is for the panelists. How can leaders in healthcare better educate the public and policymakers on the importance of utilization, the most up-to-date scientific evidence when evaluating decisions that should be made regarding social issues? What are your thoughts regarding referencing quantitative studies, or if certain data can be quantified, or if the study is not randomized, does this impede objectivity in the reports that are submitted?
Well, I'll address part of that. So I do think one of the advantages of randomized control trials is that there's less judgment required in interpreting the results. Not none, but generally less. There were a lot of other questions in that question, so I'll defer to others.
Can you read that back again? there was a lot of sub-questions.
Maybe just the last sentence would be
Okay,
helpful.
the last sentence. What are your thoughts regarding referencing quantitative studies and if certain data cannot be quantified, or the study is not randomized? Does this impede objectivity in the reports that are submitted?
Well, one thing that I'm just going to latch on there too is the idea that there are some things that can't be quantified, and I think that that's a really important point. We have a tendency to measure, to analyze the things we can measure, and we also have a tendency to believe that if we put a name on a measure, that we have succeeded in measuring the thing that we want to measure. So, for example, I controlled for ability in my propensity score matching because I have a measure of ability. but that does not mean you really controlled for ability. You controlled for the fraction of ability that's measured by that measure. And so I think that that is an important thing for researchers to keep in mind. I'm not quite sure how to effectively communicate that type of limitation within the 2 sentences that Naomi was talking about. But sorry, my microphone fell apart. I think maybe what the thing that researchers have to do is, I think maybe what they have to do is they just have to filter appropriately what ends up in that 2 sentences so that what you are communicating has gone through a process where you can have a degree of confidence in it that you don't need to include the nuance. That would be my guess. I'm trying to imagine how to be that ant. That, the fly, sorry, that Chris was describing.
Okay, how about an audience? Any questions here? And yeah, could you please state your name and where you're from?
Hi, this is Veronica Montalva from the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank. And I have 2 questions. One is related to artificial intelligence, the use of big data for predicting things. So in general, this is not causal, but can aid some causal methodologies, maybe like the propensity score matching. So I was wondering what were your thoughts about that. And the second question regards something that really always worries me, is like what John mentioned, is that sometimes the impact of a program depends a lot on the context or on the details. So how likely do you see the government or even researchers are willing to, for instance, evaluate the impact of the same program, but of, okay, there is a little tweak here, or like we evaluate the program and we found out that there was no impact, but then we do some qualitative study and try to find out why, and then like also implement the same program, but then try to see if the effect is different. Thanks.
I can take, I have thoughts on both of those, or one is just an analogy. On the machine learning, I mean, certainly machine learning is a great tool, and but I would just sort of in some sense repeat back what you said, which is that it is primarily a tool for prediction. And I think statisticians worry sometimes about these automated algorithms because it's easy to forget the science that has to, the hard thinking and the science that has to go into any analysis. And sort of there's, in some circles, and I'm not saying this room, but in some circles there's a feeling like we can just throw our data at a machine learning tool and it will give us our answer. So I think I would just reiterate what you said, which is that it's a great tool. So for propensity score estimation, machine learning methods work great, much better than logistic regression. But it's for that piece, like it's not a causal, but sort of used for the right things, I think they're great tools. On your second piece, I'll just make an analogy, which is just a sidebar from, so the Food and Drug Administration, the one part of FDA that started embracing Bayesian methods before any of the others was the devices branch. And it's because of that point where they, in the devices world, what often happens is there's a device, and then they'll make like a really little change to it, I don't know, a new, whatever, I don't know, new metal. And then they'll use Bayesian methods because they really start building up. They have a series of trials of what is fundamentally the same device but with little tweaks. And they realized that really Bayesian methods were a natural fit there and really made a lot of sense as a way to be able to accumulate information across those studies. So I just want to, it's kind of a neat connection, I think, for like using the right method in the right situation.
I mean, the thing that popped into my head is something that I know you're also interested in, Liz, which is generalizability of findings from one context to another, transportability of findings, and I think you've done work with propensity score in that area as well.
Yep.
Go ahead.
So a couple of comments. I worry about big data. I mean, not because it might be taking over our lives, although that's a different topic, but I think people sometimes think, well, there's so much data, it must be able to answer our question. And if you don't have, ideally, a design or at least an analysis plan, it's not going to, but it is going to give you significant findings. And that worries me, because it will look like you found an answer to your question. So I think that's, we just have to be alert. And then I'm really interested to hear what you said about FDA and devices and tweaking an Bayesian approach. I think it's potentially very applicable to the world of systematic evidence reviews, where I know people have been thinking about a Bayesian approach, although currently the evidence reviews are very sort of linear. But one of the challenges we've found is that even in human services, the device changes. So maybe there's a study of the ABC program that has certain findings, but then maybe somebody tried the AB program, or somebody tried the ABD program, or the ABC Plus program, and do we lump them all together, and how do we decide which ones go together and which ones don't? And so I'm going to be looking at some of that FDA stuff. Thank you.
One more webinar question.
Oh, sure. We have plenty of questions. So our next question is from Pamela Lilliston, and she's from New Jersey, DCF. And her question is, I love Chris's point about maintaining integrity of finding even when conveying the bottom line in 2-sentence summary. What is his advice on how to do this?
Open your mouth and you get yourself in trouble. So the question is, what's my advice on how to convey integrity in 2 sentences when it requires 2 volumes? I don't know. But if I take a leap of faith, then I would say that I would start with the why again. Kind of what's the fundamental why of the 2 sentences that I'm trying to get at, of the change I'm trying to make, and then from there, I don't know.
So I can build on that a little.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's a great question.
Naomi.
Okay, so build on that a little bit, just to say that I think trying to get into the head of the decision maker, or to draw out from the decision maker what they need, for the purpose at hand, and put that into your 2 sentences, because for the specific purpose that they need the information, they may not in fact need all the nuances, they just may need some of it. And then tomorrow you can give them other nuances if you get another hearing.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on that, and I'm a little flippant when I said I don't know. I think the challenge of that question is what you just raised, and that there are so many different ways to slice it. But I do actually go back to the why, because in the case of the policymaker, if you're asking what is it that they need and why they need it, then that should help you distill it down to something. So I think it does end up hooking on that why question.
John?
So I have a question. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions, but I'm going to ask you a question. Okay.
No, you're not.
So I have a question for both Naomi and Chris, and it's kind of like more or less the same question. But so on the one hand, I think I heard you say earlier, Naomi, that we want to move away from the thumbs up, thumbs down types of answers. Those are very easy to give in 2 sentences. So it's like, but we don't want to give that in 2 sentences. So it's like, how comfortable do you find decision makers to be with uncertainty? To say, thumb, how, I mean, because on the one hand, I can't believe they take us that seriously. I mean, it's like they make, they're going to make their decisions based on a wide range of inputs, including their own beliefs.
And they should.
Right, and they should. That's right.
So let me give a few-part answer to that. So one, the answer to your question is yes. We show up because we've done a nuanced implementation study, of an early childhood program, and we know, how the views of the frontline providers and the opinions of the program directors, and how those vary by geography or education, and what the parents think about it. And there is no yes or no question. I have literally showed up to present results like that and have someone say to me, give me the bottom line. And there isn't one. So it's a puzzle. But so another related point, I take some, this is a little bit like, you know, we're all just specks in the giant universe. It can be depressing, but it can be really uplifting too. So I'm a big believer in the idea that research and evaluation can be used in many ways. And it's pretty rare that it's used in the very straightforward instrumental way that we think it's used. You know, it's pretty rare that you get a really clear, simple question, you go out and get the answer, you go back to the decision maker and say the answer is 2, and they say, okay, I'm not going to fund the program then. That just doesn't happen. So, you know, yes, there's an audience, one hopes there's an audience for the big doorstopper report who's going to study the whole thing and design their future, you know, research on it or design their future program on it. Yes, that does happen. But a lot of research is used impressionistically. It goes to, you know, help influence the kind of questions that people ask or their paradigm for future decision making. It goes into the back of their mind, not the front of their mind. And that suggests that it's maybe okay if you didn't get all the nuance because it wasn't going to be absorbed anyway.
I mean, I guess a similar question, Chris. It's like when you were in the context of executive director of Dudley, I don't know I mean, you're a researcher, so you might have just talked to yourself, but if you were talking to a researcher who wasn't you, and they were giving you findings or results, you know, how seriously did you take it, and how distilled did you want it to be so that you could act on it because you're a busy person, you know, like what did you want when you're wearing that hat, you know, what did you want, and then when you're wearing your research hat, you know, what do you think that you need to do to give that, or can you give it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. As a researcher, I think I want the elements and the brick to carefully build a house. Yeah. As an executive director, I want the house not to burn down. So give me what I need to stop the fire, which is typically the case. Now the fire may be some opportunity that I need to take care of. So it doesn't have to be a negative thing, but there's usually something pressing. And I tend to believe that while it's important to learn the ideal and learn the world we want to exist in, and I first was trained as a mathematician and a physicist. Then I became an engineer. And as an engineer, it's a little bit more real world than the theoretical mathematics and physics. So for me, that the transition from kind of the idealized world to the real world is what evaluators and researchers have to understand. That policymakers think they're in the real world. You know, whether they are or not is a whole other discussion, but they think they're in the real world. And so if they're in the real world, our real world now is really small sound bites, tons of information, big data, very fast, lots of fires. So as evaluators, we have to ask ourselves that how do we exist in the real world and provide that bit of information? Because yeah, as executive director, I wanted to know something really quick right now that would, you know, maybe it's not the answer I wanted, but it's an answer that'll give me a little bit of information to stop the fire.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to exercise my prerogative now and interject a slightly finer point on what I think is a similar question. This is Zane Person. I'm the director of SIRE here. Naomi, you said something to the effect of RCTs are nice in a way because they eliminate the need for judgment. On the other hand, do we want to do that? Do we want to minimize the need for judgment, or do we want to help consumers of research be able to use their judgment skills? I think you sort of came down on the latter, but let me add to the question, which is preferable, eliminate need or help do it, and how do we get there? How can researchers help you get there?
So I hope I didn't say that RCTs eliminate the need for judgment, but I think they tend to require less application of judgment in interpreting the findings. And it was maybe a leading question there, but I certainly agree that we want to help decision makers exercise judgment, not eliminate the need for judgment. But we do want to expand the scope of fact, not to eliminate the role of judgment and ideology and experience and strategy and all of those other things, but so that so those different influences on decision making don't get mixed up.
Well, I think we're getting close to where we are going to stop asking questions, but I'd like to give the panelists, each of the panelists, a chance to provide any final closing comments. So would you want to start, Naomi?
You know, I was prepared for this, but my closing comment was going to be the comment about big data, so I'll pass. I've already said it.
Okay, how about you?
Yeah, I guess what I would hope folks in this room take away, you know, as a lot of you are talented researchers, is this idea that policymakers are never going to come to you and ask for a Bayesian posterior distribution, right? They're never going to ask to do a creative randomized design. So it's incumbent on us to sort of understand these new ways to think, new ways to design, new ways to analyze, and present those. Because that's the only way we're going to move policy making forward, is not just to keep doing what's comfortable, our propensity score matched with our p-values, but to present new ways and figure out what works best for policymakers.
I'll close by just applauding this event, and sort of I think we need more things like this where like academic statisticians can talk to people who are struggling with these sorts of things. You know, I go to statistics meetings, like our causal inference meetings, and people are doing really important, great work on various details of statistical methods, and I would love to figure out more ways to sort of help that crosstalk to be, you know, like the sensitivity analysis methods, or, you know, just hear the struggles and like what's really needed and how do we sort of make those connections in stronger ways. So I think events like this are one step towards that. So I just thank you guys for organizing it and hope that there can be other similar conversations.
Great.
Well, I did not prepare anything, but I would like to actually really thank Tim for what he just said, because that's very, very helpful. I think one thing that I will sometimes encounter is when trying to sort of encourage people to consider a new method or a new approach, I'll hear, well, our clients aren't asking for that. And my thought often is, well, why would they? How would they know to ask for that if we don't talk to them about it? And so that's, I'll just say thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah, I agree. This has been a phenomenal panel, and it's good to sort of hear the perspectives. I think a couple last minute things I'll say is that to emphasize what was said before is the importance of engagement, and engagement across every level. We do get in our silos, whatever those silos are. And the way we get out of our silos is by having the conversations and trying to do it in a way that the listener understands. A lot of times we have our conversations in ways that the messenger understands and the listener has no clue. But as soon as we do it in a way the listener understands, then we're able to better engage. And I think the final thing I'll say is it kind of gets to what you talked about, Naomi, in terms of judgment, and that's an appreciation of bias of all sorts. We are not going to eliminate bias, but we can better understand it and mitigate it to the extent that is to a certain extent, I would say. And I think that's important because then that allows us to have better answers, which then allows us in the long run to have better engagement.
Great. So I think we're pretty close to the end of the formal forum. I know several of you wanted to ask some more questions, but the panelists will be around, I think. So please do that. I want to thank everybody for attending today's forum. Anne, did you want to say something? Okay. And we hope you enjoyed the discussion. Please be sure to let us know how you think we did by completing. There's an electronic survey form that's available for all webinar participants at the close of the session, and it'll also be sent by email to all the participants who joined us in person. So again, let's give our panelists a big hand for